Hey everybody. So today is going to be a little bit longer video. I might go ahead and actually divide it into two. And I really apologize for that, but I'm trying to cram a lot of information into a short amount of time. I think it's important information that I want to get across to you guys. I'm also maybe sort of saving you a little bit of time out of the textbook reading as well. So normally, because this is a more direct instruction kind of heavy lesson, I do give kids this note sheet. You'll find this in the week 4 document as just a way to sort of organize what we're talking about today. So we're going to go through the history of American federalism through various periods. You can see here, starting nationalist period and then moving throughout history. If you want to make a copy of this or print a copy or just put something like this in your notes, it might be helpful for you. So I would highlight, again, any law or Supreme Court case or kind of the big events are going to be important. There's going to be a few new terms that I'll be bringing up. And then we did a thing in class where we tried to draw our own illustration of the balance of power. That is completely up to you. It's just one way to process the information, but you will see a few illustrations in the PowerPoint that might be helpful to you as well. Okay, so this is up on the week 4 document as well if you need to come back to anything. But as I said, we are talking about the history of American federalism. So we're going to take, all 230 plus years of history and really condense it down here, looking through this lens of the structure of our government. All right. So before we get started, one of the things yesterday I brought up to you guys is that when you're creating a government, not only are you thinking about the type of government and its economic system, you're also thinking about the government itself and how big or how small it is. So is it going to be centralized in one government like a unitary system? Is it going to be decentralized like a confederation? And we know that the founders chose this hybrid option of federalism, so this mix of states and federal government having power. The issue, and we've looked through the Constitution together, is that it doesn't really clearly define the relationship, and this is going to make the Supreme Court the very, very important in deciding who's going to have the balance of control in federalism. So one of the things I would also suggest you might want to have out beside you is the packets, the AP packets. On the second page, it does talk about the 15 required Supreme Court cases. We're going to hit on some of those today, and that might be helpful for you, just making sure you have a basis for those questions. All right, starting in our first period, the nationalist period, we're going to look at McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden. McCulloch is your first have-to-know 15 Supreme Court cases. Hopefully you guys sort of remember that from history class, but don't worry, we'll go over it. And then the Gibbons case follows up a few years later and is important as well. Okay, so those are the two that I would write down in your note sheet if you're taking notes that way. Okay, generally during this period, what is happening is that we are in a foundational period. We're trying to establish the country after the Constitution has been ratified. And we are on to our first and in many ways most important Supreme Court justice, Chief Justice. He's not the first one, but he is the most impactful early on, and that is John Marshall. So what we can generally say about John Marshall is that he increases the power of the federal government in relation to the states and also helps to establish the legitimacy of the federal government. He does this through several different cases, but the two that matter for us today, the first is McCulloch v. Maryland, and again, the second then is Gibbons v. Ogden. So a quick refresher on McCulloch versus Maryland. Congress decides that they need to create a federal bank. The issue is nowhere in Article 1, Section 8 does it say they have the enumerated power to create a bank, but they do so anyway. So that's question one. Can they create a bank? The second question involves about where this bank is located. The bank they create is in the state of Maryland. And Maryland then thinks, well, we should be able to tax this bank because it is sitting on our land and therefore subject to our state taxes. And the federal government is going to reject this notion. And so this case makes its way to the Supreme Court. And again, the court has to answer these two questions. And that's the framework for all Supreme Court decisions, is in the form of questions. How do you get your answer? You look to the Constitution. All right, so question number one, does Congress have the authority to create a bank? And John Marshall says, yes, they do. Why is that? Where in the Constitution does it say they can create a bank? He says, if you look at the enumerated powers that are dealing with money, about coining money, about borrowing money, about regulating commerce, it becomes necessary and then maybe proper, that Congress should create a bank. So this is the really, really good example of how you use implied powers to justify creation of something, I guess it's how you use enumerated powers to justify the implied power of creating a bank, I should say. So there's enumerated powers dealing with money and commerce. Therefore, it becomes necessary to create a federal bank. So the question number one is, yes, you can create the bank. Question two then is, can the state of Maryland tax such a bank? And emphatically, John Marshall says no. There's a famous quote from this where he says, the power to tax is the power to destroy. If you allowed the state, lower entity, to tax this federal entity, it might render this whole Constitution null and void. And he says, because of the supremacy clause, you cannot. So this is really important for granting more power to the federal government. The second case, Gibbons versus Ogden, is going to be referenced in the podcast I'm having you listen to for tomorrow's class. So you'll get a little more information there. The importance about Gibbons is it also establishes the supremacy of the interstate commerce clause, that it's only Congress who can be regulating commerce. Because of that clause included in Article 1, Section 8. So in both of these cases, we're seeing power given to the national government over the states. And just generally can say during this time period, the federal government is growing and, again, kind of exerting itself on the states. All right, let's get to our next time period here. Which is known as the dual federalism. And then we're going to head all the way up to Jim Crow on this particular aspect. So Dred Scott, the 14th Amendment, and Plessy would be the three main things you would want to make note of there if you're keeping notes. So first of all, what is this idea of dual federalism? So I'm just going to go ahead and put everything up here on the screen for you guys. So dual federalism is also known as layer cake federalism, is this idea that the national government is trying to operate in a very limited sphere. They have certain enumerated powers that they're supposed to do, and Congress really should not be overstepping those boundaries, nor should the president, but it's really mostly about Congress at this point. During this time period, again, if you look 1835 up there to 1861, we see a strong emphasis on states' rights as well. So while they each are doing things, they're operating basically in this idea of a layer. If you think about, like, the federal government is the top layer, the states are the middle layer, maybe the local government is the bottom layer, and they're not really overlapping much between them. Even in the area of commerce, they're really trying to keep themselves distinct. How does the Dred Scott case fit into this? If you remember the details, the main idea is that Dred Scott is suing for his freedom, as he is in one of the territories. And that should be legal because of laws that have been created by Congress. And the Supreme Court sides with the states in this case and actually says Congress exceeded its authority when it drafted that legislation and really hinders the power of the federal government. So as we're heading into the Civil War, we're seeing, again, this balance of power in many ways favoring the states. And we're seeing the Supreme Court side in 1856 with the states in their ability and really hindering and impeding in many ways what Congress is able to do at this point. All right, Civil War happens. We don't need to get into the war itself, but a couple of important things are going on here. So with the federal government winning, we could assume, reasonably so, that the Constitution is supreme, that the federal government is supreme. And with the amendments that come afterwards, it also seems like that would happen. But the problem is that doesn't solve the conflict, and we know this conflict is going to continue. And mostly this conflict is going to revolve around the 14th Amendment. When the 14th Amendment is passed after the Civil War, it importantly provides for citizenship, but it also says that each state has to provide equal protection of the law and also cannot deny due process. So if we read the 14th Amendment purely as it was structured, again, we should be able to solve most of the issues that are going to haunt us for the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and even maybe still to this day. But it's not enforced that way. So we're going to see battlegrounds emerge. And the way we'll kind of divide up the rest of this lecture is into two categories. On the one side, we're going to look at social and political battles that will continue, mostly in the areas around voting and segregation. And then we'll see economic battles revolving around how involved the federal government should be economically with the states if you're trying to take care of the nation's poor and elderly, unemployed, et cetera, et cetera. Like, what is the role for the government? So we can say the idea of layer cake, again, federal, state governments kind of operating in their own spheres, is going to continue during this time. And again, with the states retaining a lot of power. Let's look at the social political aspect then. So post Reconstruction, up until 1954. So this is the time of the Jim Crow South. We know segregation is happening in social life and education policy. And why is it allowed to continue? Well, it's allowed to continue mostly because the 14th Amendment and the way it's interpreted is not providing for equal protection. Okay, if you read the 14th Amendment, equal protection of the law, we should never have seen the horrors happening across the country that we did, in not only segregation but in lynching and many of the other ways that minorities, Black Americans in this country in particular, were suppressed. The Supreme Court, what is their role, is that they interpret the 14th Amendment to be a place where states could craft separate areas as long as they were considered quote unquote equal. And so Plessy versus Ferguson, I'm sure you've heard of this case before. You studied it in history class. It gives power to the states and allows segregation to continue from a Supreme Court perspective. And again, it takes a very weak look at the 14th Amendment, and certainly not what it was intended to be at this point. Okay, so segregation is continued. What about voting rights? So in the original Constitution, states do have the power to determine voting eligibility as well as how you vote. This is why some states have same-day registration, whereas other states you have to register 30 days in advance, and different types of voting. That is controlled by the states. It's in the Article 1. But we have something like the 15th Amendment, which says all African American men have the right to vote. That, as a federal amendment, again, should play over the states, and there shouldn't have been barriers placed there. But we know, obviously, there were grandfather clauses and literacy tests and many other barriers the states were able to put into effect. And again, the federal government was not enforcing its own amendments. So this means layer cake federalism, again, is continuing, in the states, again, are really in many ways holding the day here, especially when it comes to the social and political rights of minorities in this country. Okay, break off. We're now going to look to the second piece here. Let's go to the economics aspect of this. So if you're going to look at your paper, we're going to look at the New Deal. If your chart sheet, we're looking at the 16th Amendment. And then there are two cases, Wickard v. Filburn and the National Labor Relations Board versus Jones. They're going to come up in the podcast, again, that you're listening to for asynchronous time tomorrow. So those will play in a little bit more there. Okay. Now we're going to look at the economic side of federalism and talk about the Great Depression and the New Deal and how this plays into our understanding of American history. So you guys, obviously, this is something you studied in depth, I'm sure, last year. The main way that President Roosevelt decides he's going to try to help solve the Great Depression is through creating a very active federal government, and one that is going to be creating programs all across the country in hopes of getting people back to work. Initially, there was some challenge to this. Okay, could the federal government create one program after another, and then ask the states to actually enforce these programs? Initially, the Supreme Court is hesitant to do that, but eventually comes back around, and they do confirm these many different programs based on Congress's ability to regulate interstate commerce. And so what we're going to enter into now is a time period known as cooperative federalism. Our cake metaphor continues. It's also known as marble cake federalism. Those two terms are interchangeable, as is the third term, fiscal federalism. So if you had on an AP exam, if you actually had to write about federalism, you could reference marble cake or layer cake federalism. and you would be absolutely fine. They would understand what you're talking about there. But why is it marble cake? So the idea now is not the layers are really evaporating, and we're now seeing a blending between the federal government and the state government when it comes to the area, again, of money. Federal government is crafting and creating these programs, trying to get people back to work. Think about the TWA, the CCC, and then they're having the states administer these programs, and they're giving the states money to do so. But in order then for the states to get those money, they have to again comply with the orders or the instructions of the federal government. So they're blending, they're really crossing over. And again, this is why it's fiscal federalism, is because this is really all about that blending of money between the state and the federal government. I think it's important to note at this point, the states generally are pretty accepting of this too. Okay. They nobody knows really quite how we're going to solve this depression. And so you do see a pretty good working relationship. And again, that's why cooperative is the term there that's important. They are working together through this. So again, when you listen to the first 20 minutes of the podcast tomorrow, that is really largely all about the importance of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Do also pay attention to their mention of those two cases that I put out there earlier, especially the Wicker v. Filburn, and that'll be important for helping you understand how important interstate commerce is to justifying the work that the federal government and Congress in particular is getting ready to embark on for the rest of the 20th century. Okay, so again, now what we're having is we're seeing this move. We're moving from dual federalism to cooperative federalism, where again, programs and authority in the dual phase are very clearly divided, to this cooperative phase where programs are and authority between the two governments are really intermingling here more. All right, so I'm going to pause here. That's going to stop part one of our lecture, and then I'll move on to part two.